Nothing better to start the day off than with a nice cup of hazelnut coffee. Good morning, everyone. Brother Phil here. And this morning we're going to be looking at our last lessons in Genesis, and we're going to be looking at chapters 10 and 11 this morning. The title of our lesson today is called The Failure of Our Ancestors. One sure thing that we learn in these verses is that despite the worldwide flood, which destroyed every human on earth except Noah and his family, the human condition, that is, our sinful nature, continued on. Unfortunately, that was one thing that God, and He knew this, could not eradicate. God may have eliminated the wickedness of the world that existed during Noah's time, but that sin nature which began with Adam's transgression unfortunately remained in the surviving members of Noah's family, and it still passed on to every generation after that. Today's lesson, we're going to see the results of that sin nature continuing on. There's no escaping this fact. We begin with a listing of genealogies, locations, and nations that followed Noah. As Dr. Robinson points out, this is not a complete genealogy. It does not accurately link one generation with another. He also points out that we cannot use the names that are listed here to identify modern nations as we know them today. Why is this? Well, because through the years, the actual names, locations, and ethnic compositions of nations have changed, not to mention the geological structure of the earth has changed. So let's go ahead and dive into today's lesson. We'll begin with verse 1. Now, these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. And sons were born to them after the flood. So as you can see, life continued after the flood. Noah, as Dr. Robinson points out, is the ancestor of every living human on earth today. Every family tree will eventually find its roots in the people mentioned in these verses. However, the purpose of these verses, as laid out before us, is not to provide an accurate genealogy for mankind, but simply to teach us how the earth was repopulated after the flood and what happened next. We begin with the sons of Japheth, who most agree is the father of the Gentile people. Verse 2 says, the sons of Japheth were Gomer, not Gomer Pyle, Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, no, not that Meshech, and Tyrus. Verses 3 and 4 go on to list the sons of Gomer and Javan. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. I find it interesting that only the details of Gomer and Javan are given. God told humanity to multiply after the flood. And verse 5 indicates that that's exactly what they did. After the great flood, humanity and life went on. Verse 5 says, from these coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, every one according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Second, we have the sons of Ham in verses 6 and 7. Now the sons of Ham were Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba, and Havilah, and Sabat, and Ramah, and Sabteka, and the sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Now we zero in on one of Ham's sons in particular, and this is Cush. This is because Cush is the father of Nimrod. We find this in verses 8 through 12. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. he became a mighty one on the earth. We've all heard of Nimrod before. Verse 9 goes on and says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Notice that Nimrod built 4 cities in the land of Shinar. In the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Remember verse 10, by the way. This is going to play an important part when we get into chapter 11. In Assyria, Nimrod went on to build 3 cities. From that land, he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh. I think we may have heard of that city before. And Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah. And Rezin, between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. In verses 13 and 14, we learn about Mizraim. Mizraim became the father of Luddin and Anamim and Lehabim and Naphtuhim and Pathshurim and Casluhim, from which came the Philistines and the Caphtorim. Now, we're familiar with the Philistines. By the way, you have to forgive my Anglo-Saxon pronunciation of these names. I'm probably butchering these names up completely. This is the best I can do with them. I remember years and years ago, I had a Sunday school teacher saying, it's too bad that these names in the Old Testament were not James and Bob and Frank and Harry, names that we are obviously familiar with or that we can identify with. But anyway, these are the names that are given, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce them. It may not be right, but bear with me. Verses 15 through 19 give us some interesting facts about another one of Ham's son. His name is Canaan. A very familiar name, I'm sure. Canaan, in verse 15, became the father of Sidon, the firstborn of Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite, and afterwards the families of the Canaanites were spread abroad. A lot of these names are very familiar with us because we remember these as the enemies of Israel as they came into the land of Canaan. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon, this is verse 19 by the way, as you go toward Gerar, as far as Gaza, as you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember those names? And Admah and Zebulun as far as Lasha. And then verse 20 sums it up. He says, these are the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Finally, we have the sons of Shem in verses 21 through 31. 5 of Shem's sons are named, but some emphasis is going to be placed on one of them, and his name is Arphaxad. That is because he is the ancestor of Abram. This is all leading to a point, okay? Verse 21 says, also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber, and the older brother of Japheth, children were born. Remember, again, we're seeing a history of what happened with the sons of Noah after the flood, and we're seeing the repopulation of the earth happening. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, and Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, and Hul, Gether, and Mash. Arphaxad, remember we're going to zero in on him, okay? Arphaxad became the father of Shelah, and Shelah became the father of Aber. Pay close attention to this lineage, okay? This is important. Arphaxad, we just read that verse. Verse 25, two sons were born of Aber. The name of the one was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Joktan became the father of Almodad and Sheleph and Hazar Maveth and Jerah. Remember again, I'm doing my best. Joktan became the father of Almodad and Sheleph and, we just read that verse. Sorry about that. Verse 27, come on Phil, get it right. And Hadaram and Uzal and Diklah, and Obal, and Abimael, and Sheba, to Ophir, and Havilah, and Jobab. All these were the sons of Joktan. Wow, okay. Somehow I muddled through that. Again, these names are not the easiest to pronounce. If I was an expert on ancient Middle Eastern linguistics, I probably would be doing better, or even if I was a student of the Hebrew language, but I'm not. So I hope, again, you can forgive my mispronunciation of a lot of these ancient names. Verse 30, now their settlement extended from Mesha as you go towards Sephar, the hill country of the east. These are the sons of Shem, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. Have you noticed that this statement follows every one of the descriptions of the sons of Noah? You know, we saw this already with Ham, Japheth, and now Shem, where it always ends up saying these are the sons of, fill in the blank, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, according to their nations. Verse 32 just sort of sums up everything that we have learned about the sons of Noah. These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies. Here's those familiar words, by their nations, and out of these, and this is interesting, listen carefully, out of these the nations were separated on earth after the flood. Remember, God's plan was to multiply and fill the earth. It was never God's plan for mankind to remain in one place. Excuse me. And this is important because we're going to see some events in the next chapter that are going to show man's intentions versus God's plan. In chapter 7, we have the story of the Tower of Babel. We're familiar with this story. Verse 1 says, now the whole earth, use your imagination here for a minute and listen to these words carefully. The whole earth used the same language and the same words. Never in the history of planet Earth has this situation been like this again. I just think that's interesting that the entire earth, and by now I'm sure we had a lot of people beginning to multiply and filling the earth, but it says that they all use the same language. Can you imagine what it might be like to travel to a foreign country and you and anybody you meet speak exactly the same language without any accent or dialect? I find that interesting. I seem to say that a lot, don't I? I find that interesting. That's just me, okay? If we accept the biblical teaching that mankind has a common origin in Adam, then this simply makes sense. That there was a time when humanity spoke one language instead of the hundreds on the earth today. And I say this because you think about this. From the time of Adam up until the time of the Tower of Babel, there was only one language on the earth. And again, that's hard for us to imagine. No, I'm not going to say I find this interesting again. I got to keep myself in check here. Verse 2. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Who is it that they are talking about? I believe it's talking about all the peoples. All the peoples that came from Noah, all the descendants. They all gathered together in the land of Shinar and they settled there. Again, remember what I said. Chapter 11 is, you could call it God's plan versus man's intentions. Shinar was a term used of Babylon in Genesis chapter 10, verse 10. The multiplied descendants of the ark came together to build a great city and a tower in rebellion against God's command to spread out over all the earth. And that command is given in chapter 9 and verse 1 of Genesis. Verse 3, it says, they said to one another, and this is like, I guess you could call this is the mindset of the people at the time, okay? Remember what I said? Man's intentions versus God's plan. The people said, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone and they used tar for mortar. Now, this is kind of cool because this tar is really kind of like our modern day asphalt. What this tells us is that the elements that they used, the building materials, were waterproof. And we'll get into that in a second. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad over the whole face of the earth." Now, wait a minute. Okay. Didn't God tell them in chapter 9 of Genesis, verse 1, that they need to scatter and spread out in the earth? I mean, think about this logically. God, well, let me go back a little bit. We've got a brand new earth, okay? Even still, comparatively, the earth is very new, all right? Yeah, God wiped out all of mankind in the flood, and Noah and his family were the only ones left to repopulate the earth. God wanted them to stretch out, to spread out and fill the earth, repopulate it, but he wanted the people to scatter around. You got a big planet here, folks. And one or two people ain't gonna populate it. You got to spread out. You got to start reproducing and multiplying and filling the earth. But the people's intentions are, no. Let us just stay here in one place. Let's build this incredible great city. Let's make a name for ourselves. And they said the alternative is terrifying. They said, otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the whole face of the earth. It's almost as if somehow deep inside they had knowledge. They knew what God wanted them to do. And in absolute and deliberate rebellion, they decided, no, we're going to stay here and make a name for ourselves. The heart and the materials relevant to the Tower of Babel show that it is not only a disobedient to God's command to fill the earth, but it also shows that man did not believe in God's promise to never again flood the earth. And why do I say that? Because using the materials listed, and I talked about this just a few minutes ago, they literally built a waterproof tower. It was made to protect man against the flood, against a possible future deluge. And I say that because that tells me that they didn't quite believe God's promise to never again flood the earth with a flood. Using the same words here, okay. Now, this is a strong statement of self against God. Think about it. When they said, "Let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens," I believe they meant it. Of course, it is doubtful that they could, or anyone could ever build a tower into heaven itself. I'm not sure if they were talking about the heaven where God resides or just the sky. I really tend to believe that they were just talking about, we're going to build a tower and that thing's going to go really high up there, okay? It is more likely that they built the tower as an observation point of the heavens. It was built unto the heavens. Most astrological and occult practices have their history back in Babel. If they really, now think about this, okay? I got to look at this, scientifically and logically too. If they really wanted to build a tower to reach into heaven, it is unlikely that they would have started on the plain of Shinar, which, by the way, is at about sea level. So it's like, okay, we're going to build this tower to heaven, and we're going to start at the lowest point possible, sea level. No, common sense says that they would have started on one of the nearby mountains. Remember, this tower was real. If it's recorded in the Word of God, it is real. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus said that the Tower of Babel, still stood in his day, and he had seen it. Now, we don't need his account to verify the proof of the Tower of Babel. We have God's Word, and that's all we really need. But I just find that kind of cool. Verse 5 says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men built. And look at verse 6. The Lord said, behold, and this is just God talking, and he's making an observation. They are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And listen carefully to what God says here. He says, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Very cool. Think about this, guys. The potential of fallen man is terrible and powerful. Look at our history, not just the 20th history, but all of our history. Look at some of the things that man has conceived and designed and built. I'm talking about terrible things. I'm talking about engines of destruction. I'm talking about diseases that man has created or invented, I should say, or concocted, maybe is an even better word. I'm talking about things that have come out of the pure evil of sinful man's heart. When we think of the horrific accomplishments of evil in just the 20th century alone, this reveals what happens when you have a sinful race of people and they follow their own desires. So God is saying, you know, this is not a good thing. We've got a race of fallen people. They have banded together. They've got one language. And God himself says there's no limit to what they can do. And I don't think God's talking about blessings. I think he's talking about horrible things that they could possibly do. Verse 7, here we see again the Trinity in action. God says, come, let us, did you catch that? Let us go down. And there confuse their language so that they will not understand another speech. You know, sometimes God chooses the simple things in life to make sure that his goals are accomplished. The division of languages is a fascinating subject, and we're not going to get really into it too much, but most modern linguists believe that language is so unique that the only way they can explain it apart from God is to say that it is part of the unique evolutionary process. No, I'm not advocating evolutionary processes. I'm just talking about what modern linguists say about language. Think about this. Did God destroy the tower? No, because we just read that Herodotus, later on, the ancient historian, said that it was still standing in his time. God didn't destroy the tower. God didn't do any physical harm to the people who were building this. God did one simple little thing. He just made it so that they all spoke different languages. Can you imagine how confusing, and that's what the Bible says it was, how confusing this must have been? You know, you got one guy on one level and some guys down below, and one guy saying, pass me some more bricks. But all of a sudden, he's speaking it perhaps in Spanish, and the guys with the bricks only can speak and understand Japanese. I'm just using that as an example. Suddenly, you've got, and I don't know how many people there were here. I would guesstimate thousands of people working on this tower. How many there were is really irrelevant. What is important is that all these people working together, and suddenly they couldn't even understand each other. You know, just recently, some awesome men from our church went to Sheep Springs to build a house for Brother Rachel. Can you imagine? And some of them, they're not just from our church. We had people from all over the place. Chapel builders and many others came to work on this project. Can you imagine what it would have been like? And maybe some of them might say, well, we couldn't understand each other anyway, but can you understand, can you guess what it might have been like as they were building this house if suddenly not one of them spoke the same language? Weird, isn't it? But again, I just think this is so awesome. This is just God sometimes, all he has to do is just make a tiny little adjustment in the littlest things in life. All he did was change their languages. That's all he had to do. They could not understand another's speech. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. The forced separation of men from Babel was more God's mercy than his judgment. Yes, this displeased God because they were going against his will, but I see this as God's mercy. God is like, he's just simply intervening. That's all he's doing. He's just saying, you know what? No. No, that's not my plan. That's not my will. You're not going to do this. And he just made this little adjustment. As I say, he changed their languages and they scattered. God, in dividing man both linguistically and geographically, put a check on the power of sinful man. Think what it was like for a family to leave the area of Babel and go out on their own. And here, we're not really getting into speculation, but I just kind of use your imagination and think about this. First of all, they had to look for a suitable place to live. And I'm talking about once people scattered, okay? Languages confused, people scattered, they went their own way. They had to find a place to live. Once they found it, they had to exist by hunting and gathering, living in crude dwellings or even caves until they could support themselves by agriculture or taking advantage of the natural resources. Families would multiply rapidly, develop their own culture and their own distinctive biological and physical characteristics influenced by their environment. There's one thing that history shows us is that man adapts to his environment. And he will change certain things about himself to conform to that environment. In a small population, genetic characteristics change very quickly. And as the population of the group grew bigger and changes stabilized and became more or less permanent. So God accomplished his purpose. Mankind was scattered all over the earth. Now they're able to fill and populate the whole earth. Remember what I said earlier. It's a big planet. They got to fill it. Verse 9, therefore, its name is called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. I don't know about you, but I think this is just really cool stuff. Next, we have the descendants of Shem in verses 10 through 32. Why is so much attention given to this genealogy more than the others? Because it will eventually be part of the messianic line. It is followed in the genealogical record of Luke chapter 3 also. I'm simply going to read them and let them speak for themselves without much or any commentary. So we'll start in verse 10. We got a long reading. So you ready? Put your seatbelts on. Keep your hands and head inside the ride at all times. All right. Verse 10. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. Remember what I said? I know I said I wasn't going to comment, and here I go. I just can't help it. Remember what I said earlier about Arphaxad? Pay close attention to this gentleman. He is in the lineage of Abram, okay? And of course, Abram is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. All right. Verse 11. And Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arphaxad and had other sons and daughters. You notice that people were still living a long life. This is, remember, not too far after the flood. Before the flood, they lived even longer. Man, before the flood, people lived to be close to 1,000 years old. Here we have people living about half that time, okay, or maybe a little more. But we're still seeing the longevity of human life at this point in the human lifespan. All right, verse 12. Arphaxad lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah. And Arphaxad lived 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. Shelah lived 30 years and became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he became the father of Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And Eber lived 430 years after he became the father of Peleg, and he had other sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and became the father of Reu. And Peleg lived 209 years after he became the father of Reu, and he had other sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and became the father of Serug. And Reu lived 207 years after he became the father of Serug, and he had other sons and daughters. Now, I want to pause here. I know I said I wasn't going to make a lot of comments, but I just gotta. An observation. These men that are listed so far, do you notice roughly around the age of 30, plus maybe a few years, they had children? Now, let's go back a little bit. Did you notice how the longevity of human lifespan is beginning to diminish? Okay, let's go back to Shem in verse 11. Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arphaxad, and he had other sons and daughters. Arphaxad was 35 years old when he became the father of Shelah, and he lived 403 years. All right, Shem lived 500 years after his children were born. Arphaxad lived 400 years. Shelah lived 403 years. Eber lived 430 years. Peleg lived 209 years. Reu lived 207 years. You see, human longevity, the human lifespan longevity is going down and down and down. Okay? Now, let's keep going. Serug lived 30 years and became the father of Nahor. And Serug... Sorry about that. Okay, Serug lived 200 years after he became the father of Nahor, and he had other sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. And Nahor lived, wow, here goes down more, 119 years after he became the father of Terah. And he had other sons and daughters. Terah. Where have I heard that name before? Well, let's read on. I'm sure it'll come back to me eventually. Verse 26. Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abraham and Nahor and Haran. Abraham. Ding, ding, ding. Familiar there? Now, these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. You're probably thinking, familiar names again. Yes. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur the Chaldeans. Abram that is, and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Isaac. Sarai, verse 30, was barren and had no children. Verse 31, we're almost done here, guys. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went together out of Ur the Chaldeans in order to enter into the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, did you notice this? Terah only lived 205 years. Let's go all the way back to Shem. He lived over 530 years. So again, we're seeing the human lifespan moving downward and downward. So there you have it. A lot of history is compacted into these just 2 chapters. What did we see? We saw a glimpse of Noah's descendants. We saw the embedded sin nature show its ugly head. We saw man deciding that he didn't need to heed God's word, but rather become the master of his own fate and the captain of his own soul, as Invictus likes to say. We saw that God will still have his way with mankind. And finally, we saw that the very genesis of what would eventually become the Hebrew people and the lineage of Messiah. You see, God has a plan, and we know that. I'm speaking to the choir here. What is important to understand, guys, is that God's plan is going to unfold exactly as God has purposed it. It's an interesting lesson. Mostly it's history, not a whole lot of spiritual applications, although we did make some. I hope you've enjoyed it. Next week we move into a whole different setting. We go into the book of Job. Brother Craig will start our lessons in the book of Job for us, and we'll see how it goes from there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching and putting up with me. I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.